So hello everyone, I'm Oscar and I'm going to talk a little bit about a student's experience in lowering the voting age and specifically about encouraging youth participation through schools and other facilities because of course to make the most out of lowering the voting age to 16, we also have to make sure that the youth are participating and the youth are motivated to make political changes. So a quick overview about what I'm going to be talking about during this presentation. I'm going to talk about the current situation in Finland regarding youth participation. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about the key issues that Finland is facing regarding youth participation, and then some solutions and examples to these issues, and also some examples, as for example, Diego talked about the civic education and also the mock elections in Norway. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that in Finland as well. And then lastly, I'm going to talk about my personal experiences and how the youth are motivated in changing things politically, and also what kind of issues that we face and that my friends, for example, my friends that are students face in regarding youth participation. So youth participation in Finland as it is currently, in the study done in 2014 by the Statistics Center in Finland, they found out that out of 36 countries and 140,000 students, Finnish students in the Finnish youth had below average interest in politics. And while we had earlier today, we had a statistic that 85% of 14-year-olds said they would vote in the future, there was still very low interest in actual political activity itself. So while some of the youth were interested in voting, they were less interested in actual political activity and being politically influential people themselves. And then also, an interesting statistics in Finland is that turnout is generally lowest among the youngest in population. So as you can see here, there's a little graph that may be simplified a little bit, but it still represents the main issue, which is that between 18 to 29-year-olds, the turnout is the lowest among the whole population. And this brings out this little dilemma that we have, that essentially the youth don't care about the politics and the politics don't care about the youth. So because there's so little interest in the youth and because the youth are generally discouraged from voting and being politically active for some issues that I'm going to discuss in a second, the politics doesn't represent the youth point of view. So there's things that are decided and things that are talked about that aren't necessarily issues that concern the youth. And often this contributes to this feeling of alienation that the youth might have when looking at politics. So in some key issues that we need to look at when we're talking about youth participation, first we need to mention the 5 agents. So the 5 agents of youth participation are education, voluntary associations, dialogue between family, dialogue between peers, and the representation of politics and youth participation in the media. And the issue in a lot of places might be that there's not enough of the 5 agents and that the 5 agents aren't sufficiently represented in a country. So for example, in Finland, education was really good, and the civic education, as we've talked about today, it was really, really impressive, and the students knew a lot about the political system in Finland, yet there was a lack of dialogue between the family and the peers in Finland. So that's why generally the youth were less interested in politics and political decision making. And then also there's this feeling of powerlessness that's visible, which is when a lot of the time the youth might be motivated to make a change, but they don't feel that they in practice know what to do when they want to make a change. And this can also be increased by, for example, education, because in Finland as well, a lot of students know and understand how politics works. And an example that we've talked about a lot was that they know how many members of parliament there are. They know everything about democracy that there is to say, pretty much. But then in practice, they don't know how to actually make political changes and if they want to influence politically what they should do. So some solutions is, for example, of course, obviously address the 5 agents, make sure there is enough education, voluntary associations, dialogue between family, dialogue between peers and media. But most importantly, we need to make sure that this is targeted at the youth. So essentially when, for example, we have media and we have other kinds of voluntary associations, we need to make sure that these address these contemporary issues that the youth have nowadays in politics. And also another thing that's really important is that we encourage this sort of practical mindset of political influencing. So for example, as again I say, Diego talked about mock elections, and I thought that was a really good example of this because it shows students in practice how it is to vote, and it sort of familiarizes them with the process, which allows them to feel more familiar with voting and more familiar with politics. And then also another thing that is really valuable in education is that you pair it with these, of course, again, practical things such as student committees, student boards, where students vote for certain representatives that change their local committee in the school. Local community. So this again shows how political activity can have an influence on their community, and it can also encourage them to be politically active because they see that what they do and who they vote for can actually have a change in how they personally live their life. And then as an example of this targeting the 5 agents at the youth, I brought up this example of Malala Yousafzai, a women's rights activist, and she's very young and also very well represented in the media, I think. And I think essentially why this is so important is because when the youth see their peers, people like them being represented in the media, they feel that they too can have an effect because they see that a lot of young people are having a political influence and they're doing things politically. They also feel encouraged themselves to make a change because they see that people like them are doing it as well. So then lastly, a little bit about my personal experience with youth participation. I feel that in general, the youth are really motivated to make a change. And while they might not necessarily care about politics even, they might not know a lot about politics, almost every young person I've met is generally in some way wants to influence politics. And they have some idea on how to improve the community that they're living in. And then essentially, I feel that the issue that a lot of them face is this powerlessness, that they have so many great ideas, they have so many ways that they feel that they could influence their society and their community. However, they feel that they essentially lack the power. They don't know how to really influence their local community. So, of course, this can be addressed by making these practical solutions and allowing the youth to get this practical mindset of how to actually influence politically through the student committees and mock elections and so on. And then lastly, what I also feel is prevalent is this feeling of alienation. So the youth feel sometimes that politics might not necessarily might not concern them personally. And of course, this is why it's so important to target these 5 agents at the youth to make sure that the youth see that politics is an issue that concerns them. And for example, when we have these political forums and political dialogues that are official and have a lot of people in them, we need to ensure that there's young people also, and young people's issues are being represented and discussed, because that way the youth can feel that they're really being included in politics and that their opinions also matter. Because ultimately, a society in which the youth feel compelled, they feel motivated to do something politically is a society in which democracy can be at its full potential. Yeah, that's all I had to say. And these are my social